space bar. If he needs to go back.
Oh, we almost need to go tell him that right now.
I did tell him that he was.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll stand up here when he gets started, and then I'll go down.
Space bar, space bar.
Okay. Okay, let's go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our talk on Father Francis Pierz, and also a travelogue done by Jane Cardinal and Dave Schimmel, and some other words of wisdom from our pastor. I would like to thank Stephen Vanek, our flute player. It was a very nice touch. A very nice touch. At this time, we have these wonderful candlesticks over here that they're silver plated over copper, and there's 3 more that Holy Childhood also has. The 4th pastor that we're going to talk about tonight, Father Francis Pierz, we understand it looks like he ordered them while he was pastor here between 1839 and 1852. He ordered them from Slovenia, from a good silversmith that was named Matthias Schreiner. And I think you can see up on the wall the maker's marks on the candlestick at the bottom there. So we did some research, and we found out that he was most likely he was a German Austrian person of heritage, and he had moved to Slovenia and was doing possible silver work there, and he made these gorgeous candles. And what a great historical thing to have at Holy Childhood. I would at this point to ask Deacon Curtis Chambers with the Gaylord Diocese to come and light these candles.
Still work, folks.
Thank you, Curtis. Curtis is the past Burt Lake Band chairman of the Ottawa tribe. I would, at this time, like to ask Father Mitchell Roman, pastor of Holy Childhood, to come up here and give us his wisdom.
Unlike Sundays, I'm going to start a timer, so I know how long I'm going to go for. So beautiful to be with you tonight, and I don't feel worthy to be here in a way because, in a way, we're walking in the footsteps of giants with these very incredible priestly men who were also called the Black Robes, right, as they come from the Jesuit missionaries. And these men gave their lives to this area, an area where they were not born, and to souls that they did not ever dream of knowing. And it inspires me as a priest just to read about these incredible missionaries and to see their fruits. And so I'm just going to give the introductory remarks tonight before I pass it off to the masters of these incredible missionaries, especially Father Pierz. So I'm going to just begin with a prayer from the Pasture for the Soul and Prayer Book of Bishop Baraga. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is the introduction. O Lord, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ teaches us that God is spirit, and that whoever wishes to properly worship him must pray in spirit and in truth. Therefore, you also must always pray in spirit and in truth, and your prayer will be pleasing to God, and your soul will be redeemed. Pray in spirit. Have your spirit concentrate when praying, never dwelling on thoughts that do not belong in prayer. Rather, lift up your spirit and your heart each and every time you pray to God, and that way you will pray in spirit. Pray also in truth. Show through your actions that you truly wish to receive from God with his help and grace what you ask of him. When you ask for the favorable virtues of love, humility, patience, obedience, purity, or temporal goods, strive to achieve all these also in truth, or else your prayers will be the opposite of your actions, and therefore not true but hypocritical. Also, think of me when praying to God, and I will in turn think of you when offering Holy Mass. We pray for one another that we will be saved. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This was the prayer of Bishop Baraga for everyone to read his prayer book. This was the man who met and knew Father Pierz. These were kindred spirits in a difficult world, but they knew that since God is spirit, that God is with them wherever they go. And so in the introduction to Father Pierz, he was born in Slovenia, and during that time in which he was born, there was the Napoleonic Wars. So just as many saintly men are born into not easy circumstances, so very difficult circumstances. And so in this time when Napoleon, after 2 decades of with ruling with power, the last part of his reign very much brought much great difficulty to Christians and to the church and to just the countries in Europe. And the Frenchmen of the Napoleonic Wars actually laid waste to many of the fields of the men that lived and families that lived in these countries like Slovenia. And so Father Pierz, before he was Father Pierz as Francis, he did what any young man would do. He picked up what was in front of him and tried to provide for his town, for his family. And he came from a very wonderful family. Actually, 2 of his brothers were priests, and little else is known about his other siblings. They think that there were at least 2 more and a sister, but 3 priests in one family. So this man picks up from this devastation of the Napoleonic Wars and learns how to farm because people need to eat. And so in his time of farming, he had no idea that through that difficulty, God was preparing him for a skill he would use 50 years later when he comes to northern Michigan. He came to America, not when he was a sprite young priest at 30 years old, but he was 50 years old when he took up this calling to be a missionary priest. Hearing of the great stories of Bishop Baraga really did inspire him. A Slovenian, a man after his own blood and heart, was over there doing incredible things. And so after hearing upon this, he felt in his heart to ask his bishop, Bishop Wolf, to release him. And it said in the accounts of Bishop Wolf that with a sorrowing heart, he released a benevolent priest to Detroit. So for hoping he would come back, but with no conditions and a generous heart, Bishop Wolf allowed Father Pierz to go out to the missions. Father Pierz mentioned that when he came over here to the missions, like Bishop Baraga, he was very well off with his languages, but not having ever experienced the native language. He would take great heart to learn to speak with the natives because he took so much care that every soul that God put in front of him was his child. And in order to love our children, we must know how to communicate with them. And so it was written that even though he started to learn the language, he was able to hear confessions, but he couldn't talk and give out. And so he'd have a translator, and he worked for years perfecting the language so that he could be with his children. And that says a lot about Father Pierz. He arrived first to Holy Cross in 1835. And what he found, in a very beautiful way, and as a priest, I really appreciate this, he arrived where people were already talking about, with good reputation, the priests that have come before. They talked about the black robes and the Frenchmen that arrived 100 years before. And actually, it said the Native Americans here didn't call it the Catholic faith, they called it the French faith, because they were so indebted to these warm and loving men who lived with them. And so when he came to Holy Cross, he started to go on many of his family visits, and there's so many stories about him trying to bring the love of Jesus Christ into the hearts of those who he met with some resistance, actually a lot of resistance. He never forced the faith onto anyone, but always allowed it to be a conversation. And there was actually one story of a girl who he absolutely adored, and at first her parents weren't wanting her to be baptized, and he never created a conflict. He says, you must do what your parents would tell you. And they were so worried about the faith that they actually moved away from Holy Cross, but upon moving, she became deathly ill. And the parents moved back to Holy Cross and saying, Father, you loved our daughter. Will you pray for her and baptize her? Because we know that this meant so much to her. And on her deathbed, this little girl who she baptized, she watched her parents get baptized by Father Pierz. This was a man who loved each and every soul that he met, but he was also so much more. He would go off to Minnesota. He started called the Father of the Diocese of St. Cloud. He spent much time up in Sault Ste. Marie. He established the first Catholic school in Sault Ste. Marie. And he taught them, with the help of all the natives here, how to farm. And I talked about first with pears, and then it worked on to corn and other potatoes and other ways for sustenance that I'm sure Deacon Vidmar will talk about more. And lastly, he loved Bishop Baraga. When they met one time with Bishop Baraga's sister, Antonia, at La Pointe, Minnesota, that he says, Father Pierz about Baraga, his entire untiring zeal is praiseworthy, and he is indeed spoken of everywhere in glowing terms. He is undoubtedly the most pious priest and the best missionary to this area. And so, as I could go on and talk so much more, but there's so many more greater minds, I want to just end with my reflection on the book that Mrs. Jane Cardinal has written on Father Pierz, which I encourage you to please take in the back and purchase, meant for our children to explore the great life of this man. And so this is what I wrote on the front cover as I conclude. A true man of God, Father Francis Xavier Pierz came to the New World to continue the hard work and labors of a faithful shepherd of the Native American community in the Arbor Croach. Arriving in the New World in the 1830s, Father Pierz shined as a light of Christ, continuing to love and teach the Indian missions with the same cares as the previous Father Baraga. In God's providence, Father Pierz was gifted in different ways than his predecessor that forever transformed the communities he served. In addition to his priesthood and provider of the supernatural sacraments of the Catholic Church, his unique gift was farming and agriculture. He brought a skill from the old world that would become a very way of sustenance to the missions of communities he served. In this exciting account of Father Pierz's life, there are many life lessons to be learned from this holy priest and spiritual father. He spent months studying the Ottawa language in order to personally communicate with the native people. He journeyed through forests, rivers, swamps, and narrow trails for the salvation of souls, with a 70-pound pack on his back, no less. He saved a great number of his community from smallpox virus by preemptively requesting medicine. He emphasized manners when speaking to new communities, approaching the chiefs with gentleness and humility. He became an advocate for the Native Americans when they were in danger of being taken advantage of by European settlers. This culminated with Father Pierz even writing President John Tyler on behalf of his communities. While no answer was received, he petitioned Congress, who eventually granted the Ottawa people the permission to buy and retain property, and the list goes on and on. In these pages, you will learn the truth of a man who truly showed the face of God and the stability provided by the establishment of the early Catholic Church in northern Michigan. The Holy Spirit provided the grace, and Father Pierz provided the will and tireless effort. His crowning achievement was the pride he took in the Christians expressed by the Native Americans who grew to know and understand the person of Jesus Christ. He recounted that the reception of the sacraments by some of the boys and young men were as pure as angels. He loved the families and cultivated both food for the body and food for the soul. May this story of Father Pierz inspire many Christians to live with a missionary zeal and use their gifts for the upbuilding of the kingdom today. May you enjoy the presentations tonight, and may the wonderful Father Pierz and Bishop Baraga intercede for us from, by God's grace, their place with our Lord. God bless you.
That was a wonderful speech, Father. Wonderful. I wanted to tell everybody, we've been talking about the black robes, and when Father Francis Pierz came, he was older, like Father said. He was older priest, and usually it was younger priests that came. Baraga was quite young when he came. Well, the Native Americans, and some of the whites, I understand even, they had a nickname for him. Bishop Baraga, we all know, is the snowshoe priest. But Father Pierz was Old Black Robe because he was up in age. I would like to now invite Bob Rasmussen and Roger Clark with the 4th degree for this area, Knights of Columbus, to come and present the flag so we can say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So I have just a couple announcements, and then we'll move on with the program. I'd like to thank everyone in the kitchen and everybody that helped with the preparation of the hall. There's been quite a few people helping. We've had the Harbor Springs Knights of Columbus have helped. We've had a lot of parish parishioners helping. Margot Moose did a lot of the work on the food. And the Heritage Committee really thanks everybody for coming tonight. We also have St. Michael's, the Archangel High School here tonight, and they're going to help do some cleanup afterwards. And I got to say, we have to always consider our youth and the education, the Catholic education, you guys. And that's why it's very important afterwards you go over and look at the stuff we have over there. The Bishop Baraga book, Father Pierz coloring book, the coloring books and that. I think that in the future they're going to be used with the children of the diocese possibly to show them, you know, what our Catholic faith is. We should be really proud of our Catholic faith. So at this point, I would like to invite Deacon Vidmar to come up and give his talk. So Deacon Vidmar is a researcher of especially the Slovenian priests that came to the missions, which was Michigan, Wisconsin, the UP, Minnesota, and he specializes in Bishop Baraga and Father Francis Pierz. And he runs a retreat house in Chicago, and he has a doctorate in philosophy. I wasn't supposed to say that, but I did. And welcome, Deacon.
Thank you, Joe. A tear came to my eye when Deacon Curtis lit those candles. It touched my heart to know something that Father Pierz ordered, brought to America, and had used for sacramental purposes was put into sacramental use again. I think it warmed his heart to know that part is still here. Joe mentioned being careful about paying attention to our youth. I want to invoke my grandfather's memory at this point. My parents and grandparents are all refugees. And my grandfather brought me up to the UP when I was 16 years old. And we stopped here. We stopped at Goodhart. He showed me all the Baraga sites. He'd been regaling me of stories about Bishop Baraga and Father Pierz since the time I could crawl. What he said was, Bishop Baraga was a true Slovenian. And by that, he took the faith that was given to him by his parents and he passed it on to others. And he wanted to teach me what it meant to be a Christian. It's to emulate Bishop Baraga. And that lesson was passed on to me as a child. And so this is something that we need to emulate ourselves. I am personally tied to both these men. My father was born less than 10 kilometers away from Dobranic, where Bishop Baraga was baptized. And he had a habit that 3 times that he went home to Slovenia, he always stopped in the church where he was baptized to pray at the baptismal font where he was baptized. And I learned to also do the same. When I go home to where I was born, I try to visit the baptismal font where I was baptized in order to thank God for the faith that's been given to me. Father Pierz, I still have cousins living almost right next door to where he was born, and he's the opposite of Baraga. So Baraga was born with a spoon in his mouth, right? Very affluent family. His mother actually could trace herself back to Austrian nobility. Pierz was the opposite. Yes, his family were farmers, but they were landless fathers. His father was an agronomist. He'd be hired out by other people. So as much as Baraga was born with a spoon in his mouth, Pierz was born with a grafting knife in his hand. And he never lost that ability to worry about both the spirit of people as well as their bodies. And that's really the focus of what I want to talk about in terms of Pierz. Dave, do I just hit the space bar? Feed the body, feed the spirit. One of the things that has always amazed me about this area from the first time I ever come up here is that there's some beautiful farmland. And what always struck me as being strange is why was Father Pierz creating terraces in the canyons along the lakeshore? Why would you need to do this with all this beautiful land? What I didn't realize that when Baraga showed up and when Pierz showed up about 5 years after, there weren't any farmlands up here. This was virgin forest from roughly Muskegon to Saginaw, going all the way up to the Straits. The forest was so thick that sunlight only came through at the height of noon. Nobody lived in the interior, so the settlement pattern was all around the shoreline. That's where the people were. And because of that, it couldn't bear a very large population. Fishing was important for sustenance, as was hunting, but hunting was not many overnight trips because it wasn't a great place to live. There was some maple syrup, maple sugar harvesting on the inside, but people didn't stay there long because it wasn't a great place to inhabit. The other thing that Pierz discovered was that the Sioux was an area where people would go to get their annual allotments from the government. It bothered him greatly because it led to unstable settlements. People would move from here, they'd move up to the Sioux in order to get the settlements that they were owed by the government. Then they'd come back when the weather changed. And he realized that if you wanted to create stable communities to be able to help Christianize people, what you needed to do is deal not just with spirit, but you had to deal with the settlement pattern, which is so driven by government subsidies. Father mentioned, he had a terrible struggle with the Ottawa language. So, I'm a Slav. The joke they have with Slavs is that you need to import vowels in order to understand words. We don't have an ear for vowels. And the Native American languages were very much structured on vowel structures in their words. For somebody who was 50 years old, this was almost indecipherable. Baraga came here, as well as other missionaries when they were younger, and they slowly managed to grasp. They could train their ear to pick up the vowels. And so both Baraga and Pierz were born under the French occupation of that part of Central Europe. They're both fluent in French, so for the longest time, he used translators as much as possible, and it bothered him to his soul. Because he himself realized how important it is to be able to speak to somebody in their own native tongue. And so he got to the point where he actually questioned his own vocation as a missionary, and he felt that perhaps this was a sign from God that he should try something else. And then after one last prayer, he had an epiphany, and his ear changed, and he could suddenly understand, and his mouth changed, and he could start to pronounce the words as they should be pronounced. He felt that if he could do it, every missionary that was assigned to him could do it as well. And to the end of his life, he made sure that all who came to help him work among first the Ottawa and then the Ojibwe were, as soon as possible, learned how to speak, how to sing, how to pray, to use all the materials that had been translated mostly by Baraga into the native language, to be able to use those. So it was so important to be able to instruct people, converse with people, pray with people in the language that was first in their hearts. He didn't start boarding schools. I was upset. I saw in the Michigan Advocate magazine, I was doing some research on Upper Michigan, and they made it sound like he started boarding schools. He didn't start any boarding schools. Pierz and Baraga both believed that the best thing you could do is to keep children with their families. Pierz actually made the observation that the fastest way to convert parents was to bring the children in, teach them, and then the parents would wonder what's going on. If he approached the parents first, he hit walls. But the children were receptive, and then the parents got interested, and then he was able to convert parents as well. It's true that at times they had to stay overnight. You think about the distances. Later on, I'll have a slide. The area he covered, I mean, if you're thinking from the Manistee all the way up to to Mackinac Island, children, in order to go to school, would have to sometimes spend overnights. And they were overnights, but these were not the kind of boarding schools that we think of later on. But the most important thing is they didn't believe in separating family units. The other thing that Pierz is famous for, and he wrote back and forth, is that he didn't believe in this thing that you've got to civilize an Indian before you can convert them. That made no sense for him, and that would ring. As somebody who grew up in the Slavic culture as we did, we were accused of this also. I tell people the base word for Slav is slave in Latin. We're the underclass. Even during World War II, were treated as underclass. I said my parents are refugees. My father survived almost 2 years in an Italian prison of war camp, not a prison of war camp, a labor camp. His two cousins didn't survive. The death rate was higher than Buchenwald. My grandfather survived a Gestapo camp. He was at Mauthausen and Leubel, which also had extremely high mortality rates. And so going back in our culture, we always understood that we were never on top of the food chain. We're always at the bottom. When these missionaries came here, they understood the mentality of these people, how important it was to be able to deal with them within their own cultural context. This is something that they themselves had grown up with. Joe mentioned I run a retreat house. It's called the Baraga Retreat House, actually. Slovenian Franciscans started this retreat house in 1949, and somewhere in the middle 1960s, we started doing AA retreats. Probably 3/4 of the retreats we do are AA retreats. And I laugh about this because I think it's very apropos that we named the retreat house after Bishop Baraga. And thanks to Jane Cardinal, I now have an icon of Father Pierz as well hanging in the retreat house. Both of these two men were huge promoters of sobriety. And this didn't start here in the United States, this started back home. Pierz, as an agronomist, was an accomplished grower of orchards. In fact, he won awards back home. He wrote a book that's still used in the Department of Agriculture at the University of Ljubljana on orchard keeping. One of the things that he condemned from the earliest times when he began writing was the conversion of fruit into brandies, schnapps. And he wrote about the evil it causes. And so this isn't an evil that was somehow, you hear these things about that it's inherent in the nature of Native Americans. Pierz and Baraga would totally disagree with that because they saw the problems with alcohol already in their times with their own people that they missioned to back in Slovenia. And it was only worse here, not just among Native American populations, but also as well in the so-called white populations. They saw the damage it did right and left. Why was it exacerbated more with Native American populations? It's because when they went up to get their annual subsidy from the federal government, there were political forces in play which held that money back. It needs to be stopped there for greater amounts of times. And so what happened, they then became prey to the constant temptation of the traders, who oftentimes wiled away the times to be able to bargain with them with one thing that they had plenty of, which was alcohol. One of the things that Pierz said more than once, and he documented this in his writing, that he was very impressed with the religiosity of the flock that they had here in Michigan. In fact, this is an ouch moment because my ancestors on my mother's side were parishioners in the last parish that he had. And he often commented that the people here were better than his last parishioners. He had this tremendous belief, so if I'm going to feed the body, I have to feed the soul both simultaneously. He felt he needed to help lead people out of poverty. Fishing and hunting and being at the mercy of government subsidies were causing this pattern of people moving around. So one of the things that he wanted to get them away from being so vulnerable to traders. And so what did he do? He did start instituting craftsman programs in carpentry, furniture making, tinning, blacksmithing. For women, he made sure that he imported looms. And so what he wanted to do is be able to teach people how to use skills that would permit them to have a more stable, independent livelihood. And what he taught them was also agronomy. There's a misconception at times thinking that the Indians didn't farm. That's not true. They had potatoes. In fact, in some places in the United States, they had large cornfields. But it was the productivity of the soil and how to get more out of plots of land, which he excelled at. The other thing that he knew, which there weren't any of, today we were at Joe Hoffman's family's farm, the farm outside of Petoskey. We had a chance to buy all kinds of different apples, and it's hard to believe that 107 years ago, they weren't in this area. We didn't have apples. We had no peaches. There's no pears. These were all brought in from the outside. And Pierz was one of the people that was instrumental into bringing this up in this upper part of the Lower Peninsula. But besides that, he learned how to bring in, he had friends of his send in seeds for different types of beans and peas, tomatoes, green peppers, onions, leeks. And he showed people how to plant them intensively and how to fertilize. And he had iron implements imported also as well, and then taught how to use these in order to increase the productivity. So this helped people to gain a certain amount of self-reliance. Third part of this is that he also believed in heal the body. So you heal the soul, heal the body, feed the soul, feed the body, heal the body. He was a homeopath, naturopath. So priests in rural Slovenia, since there weren't any doctors available, most of them had grown up in rural areas. They were very attuned to the knowledges concerning herbs and how to use herbs in order to cure common illnesses. And what he did is he used his skills in order to be a doctor to these people. Twice in epidemics in 1842 and 1846, when there were epidemics of smallpox and cholera, he actually on his own got vaccines sent to him, and he went from here all the way up to the Sioux and inoculated people. Father mentioned before what a pistol this guy was. I use the word pistol. Father didn't use that word. He was so insistent on helping people to achieve the rights that they deserved that he actually wrote President Tyler. He appealed to the Michigan legislature. He appealed to county legislatures. What he was after was being able to get people to be able to own land. A couple of years ago, I was in the archives in the Diocese of Marquette, and they asked me to review some microfilm. They asked me, is this Slovenia? I said, it's not Slovenia, it's French. And these were microfilms from the 1850s that had been sent down. There's actually a complete copy also down at the University of Notre Dame archives. And among these, I found the annual reports that Father Pierz wrote to the Bishop of Detroit in the middle 1840s. In 1844, he wrote the bishop, we are making great progress with the natives. We're teaching them carpentry, woodworking, the tinning and the blacksmithing, and the women are learning the women's arts. And he said, they're starting to move Indians across the Mississippi River. You need to stop this. A year later, in 1845, his report says, a year ago, I wrote you a letter saying that you need to stop this. You haven't done anything, and so we will. Those are very threatening words from a priest to his bishop. And what happened is those weren't lame words. Those are words they actually enacted. He and Bishop Baraga began to buy pockets of land around here, around Sugar Island, around the Sioux, around lands. And what they did is they deeded it over to the Indians. And what did this do? If you take a look at the entire trail of tears that we see from this area all the way down into Tennessee and Kentucky, this area had the fewest number of Indians stretching into the UP that got moved of any of these. These two men, almost on their own sure will, working with the local bands of Indians, managed to keep as many people as possible in the area where they lived and not be moved west across the Mississippi. What's always bothered me is why did Father Pierz decide to leave Michigan in 1852? So if you look at it, the pattern, when he arrives here in 1835, he went to Detroit. His intention was to go up to visit Bishop Baraga, spend some time. At that point, Bishop Baraga was in LaPointe, Wisconsin. And it was winter already. It was October. Some parts of the lakes had already started to freeze. And so the bishop held him and instead sent him to Arb Crow. She sent him to this area. And then he sent him up to the Sioux. From the Sioux, he made his way around the lake. And eventually, 1838, so remember, this is a 3-year trip. 1838, he finally makes it to meet up with Baraga, a person he hadn't seen probably in over 20 years. And at that point in time, Baraga convinces him to go to Grand Portage on the North Shore, right on the border of what's now the United States and Canada. And he functioned there for a little more than a year, and then the Bishop of Detroit ordered him back to this area. And he came back in 1839. He was here to 1852. It was, from all standards, a very successful mission. Why would you leave this? Well, first off, my first feeling was that he didn't get along very well with his bishop. He had troubles with Bishop Reese for a number of reasons. When Reese sent him from Arb Crush to Sault Ste. Marie, there was a church that was half built that was full of debt. And there was no money that was ever produced out of Detroit in order to cover the expenses. It got so bad there that the American Fur Company seized the assets of the mission there and sold them. And so their entire potato crop got sold off, which meant that not only didn't Father Pierz have anything to eat for that winter, neither did all the Indians that were there with him. That left almost an indelible impression of how cruel that was. Second thing is that when Pierz came to America, his goods were shipped from New York to Detroit and then lost. And he was never received permission from the bishop to go search for his belongings. And that bothered him to the end. He thought it would be kind of a trivial thing, wouldn't have taken a lot of time. Third thing, which I don't think most people realize, is that these bishops, Baraga, Pierz, all the rest of them that worked this area, Lauderdale, Father Chabul up in the UP, none of them ever received 1 cent in support from the Bishop of Detroit, not 1 penny. And the people that they worked with had no money. This wasn't a money kind of economy, and so they were almost totally dependent upon whatever they received from immigrant societies in Europe. And the largest one, of course, was the Leopoldine Society, which was begun literally they began it for Bishop Baraga in 1829 once they realized he was going to go, and then they continued to fund Austrian Empire-based priests for the next 50 years. And at times, some of that money, when it usually came through Detroit, and not all the money ever made it to the missionaries. Sometimes the bishops decided to use it in other places. Pierz took great offense to this, given the fact that they were living in almost sheer poverty. Finally, the last thing that bothered him, I've already mentioned the fact that he was upset with the Bishop of Detroit not doing anything to stop the movement of Indians across the Mississippi. But the last thing that bothered him is that he continued to request help. And so he worked from 1839 to 1947 without any help, covering, like I just imagined, to explain this territory that went from Manistee up to the Straits and back down to almost Saginaw. Finally, when he got Father Marak in 1847, they split the area almost in half, and he got a little bit of relief. The more I read into his life, I realized that this man probably had problems with bishops most of his life. And it was the type of personality he was. He was very strong-willed, and he felt that when he gave some advice that should be taken, that doesn't always happen. Most of us have worked in positions where there's somebody above you, and at times you just have to listen. And at times, I've taken a look at the times when the Bishop of Detroit took money and it didn't all come up, and it's not like they wasted it. They had other areas, mostly in central Michigan, that were also deprived, that needed help. And all the bishop was trying to do is distribute some of the funds. And if you take a look at the number of people that lived here, I'm sure at times what the bishop decided was he was trying to do a more equitable distribution. But that wasn't the way Pierz saw it. But I think there's something else that's different. The topography here, which I described before, which is all primeval forest, could not support a large population. So when you take a look at this area, I got some slides coming up. Let me talk about the Homestead Act of 1862 first. When I was going through high school history and I heard the Homestead Act of 1862, I kept thinking of Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska. These areas which were settled by sod busters, and you went out there and you got 40 acres and you had to live on it for 5 years. I never thought about how it impacted the Midwest. This was relatively an unsettled area, all right?
all you have to do is make sure you didn't take up, after the Civil War, take up arms against the Union, and you could get property for free. You just had to stay on it for 5 years. But this is a telling statistic out of that period of time. Only 80 million acres of 500 million acres that were distributed between 1867 and 1904 went to homesteaders. Majority went to railroad companies and lumbering companies and other outfits. Here in Michigan, it went to logging companies. And so they could pick it up for $1.25 an acre, right? They could make that much money cutting down one tree. So they bought a tremendous amount of property and then clear cut this. So Michigan, so I'm talking again, the area from Muskegon to Saginaw up to the Straits was logged out in 20 years. They clear cut across the state. And then they moved across the states and they clear cut the UP. Then when they got the UP done, they clear cut Wisconsin from basically a little bit south of Green Bay all the way up to Lake Superior. And then they moved and they clear cut upper Minnesota. Once they clear cut this, it was open for inhabitation, for farming. So when does the first railroad come into this area? I have to laugh. I was bugging Joe Hoffman and Jane Cardinal about maps over a month ago. I wanted to find a road map for this section of Michigan from 1850. You know what that road map looks like? There's one trail that goes north up to the Straits. There aren't any roads. The forest is too thick. You had some animal paths which were overrun, which were used by Indians. There wasn't a path wide enough to take a stagecoach until after 1870. So having the railroad come in, made a huge impact in terms of what happened. I think back to all of you. When did your ancestors come into this area? When did they come in? Anybody before 1870? You would, Curtis. Absolutely, they were here. Unless you've got some Native American blood in here, the chance that you would say yes is extremely small. The census, so there aren't even census counts for what's now Emmett County and Charlevoix County for 1830 and 1840. You got to go to 1850, and actually there's almost nothing there. 1860, you know what it shows for this area? About 2,000 people. 1860, right before the Civil War breaks out, right? So when Pierz and Maroc split up this area, Pierz's missions encompassed about 1,200 souls, is what he writes. He says Maroc had about 600. So between the two of them, this is 1847, and that population's stable, doesn't really grow. They were almost at 2,000 people. The 1860 census shows 2,000 people. What does that tell you about this area? Lack of population growth. Until the railroad comes in 1873, it's not growing. So Pierz hits about 1850, and what he does is he's looking at this. I'm jumping over this because I've talked about most of this. Pierz looks at this and he says, oh, here my population counts. 1860, Emmett County's got 1,149 people. Sheboygan's got 517. Even at 1880, there's not 13,000 people in this area. All right? But that's not the point. Why does Pierz move? Pierz is a missionary. When you've got 2,000 people showing up in the census and you count your missions as having about 2,000 people, what's it telling you? I've converted everybody. I'm in maintenance mode. Pierz wasn't in maintenance mode. That had no appeal to them. If you ask him what's going to save his soul, and he writes about this, what kind of criterion does God want? Does he want God to judge him by? He says, I converted people. I brought people to Christ. And what he saw here was that, gee, I've brought as many people to Christ as I can. Somebody else can do this. I need to move on, because he felt himself. Baraga wrote at the time when Pierz was petitioning, this hurt him greatly. He didn't want to lose this missionary in this area. But he recognized that this man had a talent for this. As much as he struggled with this language, as much as he struggled with old age, he felt driven by the fact that he knew that somehow he could touch people's souls. And he felt he could touch them better in Minnesota than he could here. There wasn't anybody left. In fact, there wouldn't be anybody left to convert for another 20 years when he was almost done with his mission work in Minnesota. Minnesota at that time, the estimates are, and this is from letters that Bishop Cretin wrote, who was the bishop of St. Paul. There were 36,000 Native Americans, mostly Ojibwe, but some Sioux on the western end of Minnesota, and not a single priest among them. Not a single priest among them. There's a small cluster of priests right along what's now St. Paul running over to St. Cloud, but there was nobody else there. And what Pierz saw was a chance to save his soul. He said he felt strong. He said in spite of his old age, he could still sleep on the floor. He could still eat when there was food available and starve when there wasn't. But he saw the chance that there was a chance to be able to go and continue the work that he'd been called to come to America for. And that's why he went. He was an amazing man. He was an amazing man. I feel very fortunate to be able to have seen where he came from. I was at the church where he was baptized also this summer. And it draws onto this, what do we learn from these people? And I want to end this with what my grandfather told me. He was a true Catholic, and the reason he was a true Catholic is he took the faith that was given to him by his parents and he passed it on to others. Thank you.
That was a truly inspiring talk. Very nice. I'd like to next introduce our travel log. We're trying something new tonight. We just, between Cross Village, Holy Cross Church, and Holy Childhood here, we have, hundreds of years of Catholic history, starting way back with the Jesuits, and then, Bishop Baraga, all the other priests, and many churches, little small churches that were built, and different locations for churches, a lot of historical Native American stuff like the Crooked Tree. And we decided that it'd be kind of nice tonight to try a travelogue type series of historical sites. And so Jane Cardinal, who I'd like to come up here, if she would, and Dave Schimmel, I'd like him to stand, David. Stand up. So they spent a number of days driving around and taking photographs and preparing a presentation of just a few of the sites. If after this, seeing this, everyone thinks that this would be another, eventually like 5 months down the road or something, a nice thing to do the rest, because they've only touched just a small little sample. There's that much stuff, but they've only done this much. So thank you, David and Jane, for your hours and hours. They spent days in the car doing this.
Yeah, we did. But the neat part is there's so much history that people don't even know about. How many times do you go down 119 and you're thinking about what you're going to get for dinner, or some other odd thing? But when I was a kid, I had some influences in my family that liked history. So I got to know where places are that nobody knows where they are. And I'd like to share that. And I took Dave, and it all started with John Vidmar, because we went on a tour down 119, the Old Marquette Trail. And he was amused. And I thought, you know what? I bet most people have kids or new neighbors or grandchildren that won't ever know this stuff. And you can tell that I've been through the mill. So I have vintage pictures. When I wrote my book, I collected lots of them. So we thought, well, we'll take the drive and then we'll overlay it with vintage pictures and talk about it and tell stories. And somehow convert this to a usable product that when you go for a drive with the grandkids, you could, hey, you know what happened here? This is good. Anyway, Dave, roll it. Dave is fabulous, by the way. He is the videographer, and he has converted photographs and everything. He makes us look great. We're going to go down the Old Marquette Trail, now called M119. Before that, it was the Dixie Highway when I was a kid. Well, the reason we're doing this is because over the years, it's changed a lot. And all the time I've been here, I've collected photographs and memories, and I've read history, and I found places that nobody knows about anymore or has forgotten. And I want everybody to be able to have access to what was once here because it's so interesting. This was the center of the Catholic religion for the whole Midwest at one point. And besides that, there's some splendid stories about the frontier days and all the folks that came through here. Well, we're off M119 now. We've gone up Stutzmanville Road to Friendship Cemetery because there's a very special person up here I want you all to see. Initially, when you come in, there's a surprise. There's ironwood placards or grave markers that go back almost 150 years. They are the Weimers who owned Weimer Pond over by Lake Michigan. But let's go look at this very special grave. It belongs to Ella Petoskey. Now, Ella, of course, was the granddaughter of Ignatius Petoskey, and she had 10 acres of allotment land that she inherited from her uncle over on 7 Mile on the Wasson Grade. And the reason I'm kind of fond of coming here is because as a little girl, when we had those big funny cars in the 40s, my mom would always stop to pick up Ella if she saw her walking into harbor. And I remember her. I wasn't in awe of her yet, but my mother was. And so when we picked her up, she'd say very little, but she was a presence. And then coming home, she never wanted you to know where she lived. So she'd say, you can let me out here. And now I know all about her. And I'm very glad I found her grave. She went to Carlisle School, and she became a teacher. She was an award-winning teacher. And here she is. This is interesting. Mr. Michigan Outdoors. Mort Neff is buried here. He used to just live down the hill from me. After he retired. Ours watched his show, didn't you? He made Michigan a place, a destination in many ways. He was the first of his kind with this kind of outdoorism. And he wasn't bad looking. Let's go on to Goodhart and down the road, which is now called Lambkin Road, but it was Ottoman Road then, and visit St. Ignatius and a very special tree. Let's go. So here is St. Ignatius Church. This is the third church on this site. The second church, in 1851, the Native Americans owned all the property of Middle Village, which is New Middle Village, Apitawai'ing. And of course, there are many burials here. We can go right up this way. This is the oldest part of the cemetery right here. This is where they used to have ghost suppers. As recorded by Wes Andrews. First harvest came of the blueberries. They would share it with the deceased, and they would bring blueberries up there from the blueberry plains up in Cross Village. And in that burial lot there, there's an amazing amount of huckleberry bushes. Up by the church there used to be some Victorian cast iron beautiful crosses that were stolen, unfortunately. But there's still some great places. So beautifully quiet. Gosh, I remember this back when I was a girl, this little house. It's almost gone now. Almost gone. It used to be that Native Americans would make a house over a grave, a place for the deceased to come back to. And originally at this church, there were these little houses. And this is the only one that remained. And it was here when I was a girl. And it was the only one here, only one left. It's a beautiful place. A beautiful place. Up here a little ways, when I was walking this as a child, I noticed a very unusual and special tree. Right here. Wait a second. Yes, this is it. Look at this tree. Do you see it? It is very twisted. It is strange. If you could see this one limb, I think it's a marker tree. Now, that wouldn't be above Lampkin's thinking. He could have made a marker tree to indicate that the crooked tree was on the bluff here. I think it's a marker tree. How did the Native Americans use marker trees? Well, they took a sapling and they bent it over with a fork type piece of wood and used that to hold it in place, and then strapped it down to the ground with buckskin to hold it, and it would grow up and form curves. And they had these lots of places, usually to indicate where there was water or something special. So that is so unnatural that I thought, you know, it well could be the marker for where the old crooked tree stood. Well, that's kind of what we're doing. Of course, it was a big fat guess on my part. Solomon Francis out of Middle Village had told me that the crooked tree was on the bluff, not far from the Good Heart store area. And when I saw that tree, I thought, well, maybe. No assurance there. Nobody knows where the tree actually was, but it's kind of fun to explore and guess. But we thought we'd do this, and we would love to have people who have stories and vintage photographs to add on to it. I think it's fun to know this, and if we made a little brochure that you could, you know, maybe 15 places to stop or something like that, and have several times have them available, well, I would take my kids to see it. Well, they've already been dragged there enough, I guess. I tend to be a little pushy. Anyway, that's our idea for something to work on, and I hope you will feel free to join in with your thoughts, your photographs, and your stories too. Okay? So, thank you. Thank you. I want to hear it for Dave. He really worked hard. Okay, Joe, you're on. You're gonna let me out.
There are so many wonderful sites. When you go past St. Ignatius Lola at Goodhart and you're down on that drive, and if you're going towards Harbor Springs on that to get out the other way, there's a field that it's I don't know if it's an acre or what it is, but that's where they grew potatoes. And I just can't tell you guys how much history there is from here to Cross Village. It's just amazing the things that went on in the, and it, really we need to, our history group is looking at, our Heritage History Group of Holy Childhood, the cluster actually, we're looking at how to, like Jane said, come up with a narrative of old past photos, stories, and then try to get this all down on tape where all this was, because pretty soon it's all going to be lost. And would you be interested as a community to see more of this? I guess raise your hand if you think this was interesting. Okay. I think we will continue most likely to work on it because it needs to be done. So with that, after the talk here, we will be over at the tables with our books and and then we'll be also in the Heritage Room just down the hall. If you haven't been there tonight, we have new Father Francis Pierz, posters up on the wall with wonderful information about his life and about Holy Childhood. We also have some display cabinets with wonderful artifacts from the area and whatnot. Other than that, because I believe in Catholic education, I'm going to do something that really doesn't have to do with this. October 26th here, if I'm right, at Holy Childhood, St. Michael's is having their Polish, dinner thing. Think about getting a ticket and coming to it. We need to support St. Michael's, okay? So that concludes, I guess, our talk, unless there's questions. We will take questions, and Dr. Vidmar's here, Curtis is here. We have some, if there's anything you want to know, tonight's the night to ask because you have the experts. You can come up if you want, or you can stay there. Thank you. Is there anybody that wants to ask? We have the best of the best. We have Father here. If you have a question of Father or Dr. Vidmar. For the school? Oh, the government subsidies to the... That's something... Yeah. So I'd have to do some research on it, but I believe the 1855 treaty, that gives some money, right, you guys? We'd have to look it up. But they did get some money. You know, you had two very important treaties, the 1832 and the 1855, and they both addressed giving, I think, a little bit of money to, but it wasn't much. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay.
It seems like a silly question, but you were talking about moving the Indians across the Mississippi. Are you talking west to east or east to west?
It's east to west.
Okay, so they wanted,
Pierz starts earlier, you know, when you take a look at Cherokee Indians.
all right,
Kentucky, Tennessee, that's already in 1838, 35. These were a little later.
okay. Okay, and the purpose was?
To eradicate them.
Thank you.
So from that standpoint, actually, this area, it was good that everybody stayed, because if you went, you know, south on that, you didn't have a good life. It was terrible, I think, you know, everything I've read about it. Any other questions?
I have a question because I don't know all these things either. So to Deacon Vidmar, when you're talking about Bishop Baraga and the difference between him and Father Pierz, and how Father Pierz coming over here later, and all very interesting about how there wasn't a lot of population up here, but Bishop Baraga, would you describe Bishop Baraga's versus Father Pierz, maybe bring out characteristics about both of them, of the uniqueness of when they were here? Because if Bishop Baraga was here earlier, how did Father Pierz build on that time in kind of bringing in some of those aspects, that there weren't a lot of people here, but yet he still, how did Bishop Baraga look at it versus how did Father Pierz look at that? I'm not sure.
It's a great, is this one working? That's a great question. When I take a look at the spirituality of the two men, because that's really what drove Baraga. His spirituality was, and I'm thinking back to a book that got published about 20 years ago, two guys from Wall Street. It was, the book's name is Against the Gods, and it's a play on the word against the odds. And what they were saying is the whole history of insurance and risk-taking is no possibility of existing until Judeo-Christianity comes in, right? And because a lot of the older style, God-worshiping sects believe that God plays games with you. And what Judeo-Christianity brought in was a God who loves us, God that does not play, God who's God all-merciful. And this was really a critical part of what Baraga brought that he actually received from who then became St. Clement Hofbauer, Dvorak in Vienna. And so Baraga, from the time he wrote Pasture of the Soul before he left for America to the day he died, he believed that one of the things he had to teach people was that God is an all-forgiving God. We need to be in constant communion with God. We need to go to confessions often. Whatever puts us in relationship to God is good. And don't forget that. That was his message no matter where he was. And he never changed that message. So Pierz comes along later, and one of the things that Pierz reflects on when he comes here, he says, these people have been well pastored. He says that from the beginning. He felt very good about coming here. He didn't have to start from scratch. And so that wasn't his message. He felt the people had gotten that message, were holding that message. In fact, they had that message better than his own flock back, like I said, back in Slovenia. So I think from the standpoint of his experience here, it was that this was the people who had preceded him had done a good job. They brought Christianity to its roots here.
Okay. Yes.
I'll say this out loud. Thank you again. Really nice talks, really informative and very interesting. Do you happen to know why Baraga, since he was here first from Slovenia, why he was drawn, what the kind of the connections were drawn to this area as opposed to, let's say, out west to other Native American groups there? Like, what was it, how did that happen to, hey, come to Detroit, come to Northern Michigan? Do you happen to know any prior history of that?
That's an easy one. You have to have a little bit of perspective on American history. So the Jesuits get suppressed in 1773, right? So we have Bishop Carroll, as men came who said they wanted to go on into priesthood, he sent them back to Europe to train under the Dominicans. So Dominicans come across, and then what happens immediately after that is the French Revolution, right? Most people don't realize that a tremendous number of French-speaking priests came to the United States, and they settled the areas of the early part of the Appalachian. In fact, at one point, the Diocese of Frankfurt was like the third largest diocese in the United States, and it was completely settled by French immigrant priests who'd fled the French Revolution. Dominicans come in, and they keep pushing west, right? So if you look at what's going on far west, that's the Franciscans out in California, and they weren't really recruiting. They were recruiting from within the order. The Dominicans at that point, you've got Fenwick, who's in Cincinnati. He recruited Reese, who was a German Dominican. And then they recruited Father Samuel Mazzucchelli. So the Cincinnati Dominicans in Wisconsin, they come out of that group. So we've got the Dominicans kind of taking care of northern Kentucky, Ohio, most of Indiana, and these three guys were covering all of Michigan and most of Wisconsin and northern Illinois. And they had connections as a group back into Central and Eastern Europe, and they wrote letters, and these guys wrote German. And so what happens is stuff started appearing in German newspapers in Eastern Europe in the Austrian Empire, and Baraga read that. He almost he considered South America as well as Africa at one point. Yeah. But Bishop Fenwick's letters translated into German got to him first. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, is there anyone else want to ask a question? This is the time to do it. You have Deacon here. Okay. If not, I would ask Curtis Chambers to come up and extinguish our wonderful candles. And while he's walking up, I'll say, we will be over here with our books. The Heritage Room will be open, and please feel free to have a little more food. Yep. Okay. So, thank you very much for coming. It sounds like maybe we'll work on our travel log and make it really, really nice, and invite you back possibly in the spring or something. So thank you, everyone.
There's so many stories that we did cover. We just grabbed 3.